Hi, everyone. Welcome to Green Apple Books on the Park. My name is Cara Johnson. I'm the event coordinator for Green Apple. And tonight I have the distinct pleasure of welcoming Eddie on for the launch of his graphic novel. Thank you so much, Eddie. Eddie is joined tonight by Dr. Russell Jeung. Let's give a hand for Russell as well. Thank you. This is really special. I've been really looking forward. I was just calling Eddie a hometown hero, and I mean that, and I think you all know that to be true as well. This is a special night, and it's a special book, and I'm really glad that you are all here to celebrate it with us. And also, you brought so many snacks. Thank you so much. We have so many snacks. This is very special. Thank you all. So thank you for joining us here tonight in San Francisco and online. Hello, online audience. We're broadcasting via YouTube. We open each of our events here at Green Apple with a land acknowledgement. We are operating on unceded Ramaytush Ohlone land, and we think that acknowledgement without action leaves one wanting. So we encourage you to donate either your time or monetary means to an Indigenous organization each time you hear a land acknowledgement. We have a QR code at back desk that will direct you directly to the Ramaytush Ohlone Land Trust website, where you can find more details on this project of rematriation and how you can participate. I have very brief business before I let these two take it away. Now is a good time to silence your cell phones if you have not already. I would say picture taking is encouraged. Yeah, picture taking is encouraged. Please do that. Paparazzi out there, paparazzo. But don't take a call in the middle of the event. That would not encourage that. You could try it, but please do check out our full event calendar online at greenapplebooks.com. We have a really great season ahead of us, including the event that you are currently attending. So please do check it out. We have a lot of programming going on. The restroom is behind me. It is available after the event and not during the event for obvious reasons. If you need to know how to get there, please do ask me and I will gladly help you. And we have copies of books by both of our authors tonight at the front register. You can find them there. So many of you pre-ordered from Green Apple and other independent bookstores, which we appreciate so much. I don't know that you, because I'm a book business person, this is like very much in my brain in the world. If you don't know, it is so helpful to pre-order an author's book, especially their first book. When it's coming out, it makes them look really good before they even have a book in the world. So thank you so kindly for doing that. And also thank you to those of you who just showed up and were like, I'm going to support Eddie. I'm going to buy a book right now. Thank you so kindly. It's what keeps the lights on here. It's what keeps us in San Francisco. And we are what makes San Francisco, in part, cool and unique and interesting, is having independent bookstores and literary spaces like this. So thank you for making that happen. We appreciate it. Without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and introduce the two folks who are joining us tonight. First, Dr. Russell Jeung received a BA in Human Biology and an MA in Education from Stanford University. After working in China and in the mayor's office of San Francisco, he obtained a PhD in Sociology from Berkeley. He is author of multiple books, including Family Sacrifices and Moving Movers. He also co-produced with Valerie So the documentary The Oak Park Story, about a landmark housing lawsuit involving his fellow Cambodian and Latino tenants. In 2020, Dr. Jeung launched Stop AAPI Hate, a project of Chinese for affirmative action, the Asian Pacific Policy in the Planning Council, and the SF State Asian American Studies. He is a professor in San Francisco State University's Asian American Studies Department. Please give one more hand for Dr. Jeung. And last but most certainly not least, Eddie On has been an environmental justice attorney and nonprofit worker for 15 years. While working as the executive director of Brightline Defense, a San Francisco-based environmental justice nonprofit, he was inducted into the state of California's Clean Energy Hall of Fame for his work in equity and clean energy. In addition to his nonprofit work, he has served as president of the San Francisco Commission on the Environment, as well as a commissioner on the Metropolitan Transportation Commission and Bay Conservation and Development Commission. He is a self-taught artist who has been recognized as a cartoonist in residence by the Charles M. Schulz Museum in Santa Rosa. And his book, Advocate, is the reason we are here tonight. Let's give one more hand for Eddie On.
Well, Thank you, Carl. It's an honor to be here and to celebrate with Eddie the launch of this new book. So let's again celebrate with Eddie and congratulations. So I'm a San Francisco native too. I grew up in the Richmond, just a couple of blocks from the Richmond district, Green Apple, and so this is a real, I don't know, pleasure for me to return to a bookstore where I spent many lonely weekend nights. But Eddie, this is an amazing book, and if you haven't gotten your copy yet, make sure you get a copy before they sell out. Over 200 pages of amazing drawings and art, but also telling your story of your own, a memoir of your own life as an advocate here in San Francisco. So can you just tell us briefly, how did you come to write this book? What gave you that idea?
There are many people in the audience here that I have to recognize for supporting my art, even, 15 years ago coming to the Bay Area. In case you haven't seen it yet, I encourage you to flip through some of the comics in the back. You'll see the Sidewalk Empire, the little turtle comic where a car is pointing, as well as Wish the World. These are fiction comics I did long, long ago. And I liked fiction because it was a very neat way of tying up a narrative. And nonfiction, real life, as we know, is much messier than that. It's not as easy to create like a coherent narrative. But, after doing those comics, which mostly are very like homegrown, I would say, hand stapled, done all by hand, is how I've taught myself how to draw over a very long period of time. I've eventually made that move to nonfiction in February 2020, which, if you think about it, is just essentially a month before the pandemic happened. And it turned out to be, in many ways, the way I've grown my art career significantly. So since that time when shelter in place happened and everybody was on lockdown, essentially, it afforded me a lot of time to draw. And I've described this in the Chronicle today, but it's essentially a product of the pandemic, I would say, that ability to just... Cartooning itself is a very intense, I would say, isolated endeavor. You're alone at a desk, drawing, for dozens of hours on end, if your hand can take it, that is. So for me, I have to thank my partner for being Annie Sue, who was very patient with that process, and also just even having that time and space of mind to create this book was how it all came about.
So what came first then, the art or the idea of, I got to tell my story as an advocate?
For me, I always think about what's interesting visually. The reason why I like comics as a medium even is when you open up the page, you can instinctively tell if the art connects to you or not as a person. At the end of the day, comics, though, is a very difficult medium because it requires tying in the writing with the art. So if you have just very, amazing art, but so-so writing, in many ways, the most derogatory way of characterizing it is it's a picture book. It's not quite moving a story from panel to panel. And a lot of comic storytelling is in what's called the gutter, that, essentially that blank space in between panels and how the story moves from panel to panel. So it's always a combination. For me, it's the other weird thing about this is that I would acknowledge social media and Instagram very early on, shaping the way the story was told. It was done through, essentially all hand-drawn, intended ultimately for print. But when I started posting it on Instagram, the audience for it grew rapidly online. And that helped me think about a lot what kind of story I wanted to tell, and then the larger arc of my life through what was intended originally as 10 short stories.
Oh, I see. So why don't you tell the people what the story is about, Advocate, so they get a sense of what you're writing about or arting about?
Yeah, that's the intent. That Advocate has a double meaning in this particular book. It's meant to be, my nonprofit work about environmental policy, environmental justice work, that particularly my nonprofit Bright Line Defense does. It's also about being an advocate for oneself. So I will also cop to not knowing exactly what I wanted to write about myself initially. I was like, well, this seems like an overwhelming project. In many ways, fiction was a very kind of easy way to tell a story without having to put myself out there. And I think now that's gone through the crucible of social media, the intensity of reactions, both positive and critical, I think I've become a lot more used to producing these comics as a result.
So Advocate's about your advocacy and your own self-advocacy. And you write a lot about your immigrant family and how they shaped you. Can you talk a little bit about your family and how you think they would respond to what you've produced?
So my mother has not seen the entire comic yet. I will let you know, maybe in 2 or 3 days' time, what she thinks of it. She's also a very good reader. She is very well read generally. I hope she'll appreciate it for its craft, first and foremost, how much work went into it. It is a very personal story, though, and in large part, the book covers the trajectory of multiple generations, starting with my grandfather on my mother's side, so my mother's father. And there's a lot of unhappiness there that I have to also, essentially reveal over the course of time and how it shaped my family, the way I view it over generations. I think my mother also in conversations has realized not everything about my family portrayed in this book is going to be happy or, rose tint, glass colored. So has come to accept that as well. So fingers crossed for a good reaction.
Yeah, as an Asian American Studies professor, and I teach on Chinese American families and Asian American families. I sort of wonder how the immigrant generation sees what you're doing and how they'd respond. Do you think? Well, talk about the struggle of like your parents sacrificing so much for you, migrating here, running their own small business, and then hoping that you would go to law school to get some return on investment for their sacrifice.
Yeah.
We talk a lot about, it's called migration loss when immigrant parents come here and experience downward mobility. And most Asian kids have that sense of parental obligation where they want to repay their parents' sacrifice. That's the way of loving them, not because it's an obligation, right? But we want to show our love. So how do you, respond to the loss and sacrifice and want to repay their love?
I'm a big fan of movies and books generally that talk about immigrant success stories. And I notice like some of the more popular ones are often like a crime-driven narrative of like an immigrant who comes to the country. You think of things like The Godfather or even more violent epic like Scarface. It's essentially an immigrant story of coming to the U.S. and making it by any means necessary or possible. I would say part of that is wrapped up in the notions of success being measured by just financial success, that it's in many ways the only metric of success that people who come to this country for the first time want to strive for. The book, in many ways, is not necessarily a rejection of it. It does acknowledge the privileges, for instance, my parents were able to build for me with my education, and being able to even pursue things like nonprofit work were made impossible in part by their sacrifices that they made for me. And then it also covers another level of sacrifice, too, for my grandfather, which I would say is much more existential. It's essentially my grandfather survived a horrific military conflict where even in his memoirs, which were, really nicely translated by Eddie Chang in particular for me, and in understanding that kind of tragic arc that he essentially left roughly 10 to 12 handwritten pages at the end of his life, talking about, and the Korean War, which is, it's this massive bloody conflict that stretched on for years, was essentially in like 2 or 3 pages of it. So it just shows you how information was processed in a very different era. For me, the challenge was how to translate it to the page and make sense of it in a way that's influenced my mother and then myself too, with that kind of same awareness.
Well, the model minority expectations. What gave you the inspiration or the drive or the ambition or the motivation to do something a little bit different than most Asians? Not to stereotype or essentialize yourself.
There is a nice board here that shows my experience of growing up in the U.S. And I like to cheerfully say, like, this book is in many ways a very American and un-American tale. American in the sense that it spans geography, it spans like living in a lot of different cultures and working with a lot of different communities. For instance, through the nonprofit service work that I did in Oakland, Chinatown, I'm not Chinese by ethnicity, but it was very much for me wanting to invest in that community, to be generous and serve elementary students in that way. And I talk about how that in many ways was about income and education and serving communities on their own level. I also think a lot about, not only the geographic scope of my life, but also what I think through in terms of trying to create the art to begin with, which was like a very kind of driven process. And I've always had that creative moment that makes me want to work against the stereotype of, say, a model minority. I recognize in many ways I have kind of the markers of what a model minority should be: an Ivy League college degree, a law school degree, etc. But I've always wanted to use it for something more, and that's always something that's driven me both in the advocacy and nonprofit work that I do, as well as the art.
And so you then, in a lot of ways, starting with your work in Oakland, Chinatown, pursued that career of service, of public service, and doing the advocacy. And you've come across not just only working with the Asian American community, but again, in multiracial, diverse communities. And so can you explain to us what you think it means to be an advocate, especially when you're not part of the community necessarily that you're advocating for? What's that relationship for you as the advocate with the community?
Earlier, when I described this book as being very American and un-American, I think it was American in the sense that, there's a wide variety of experiences, portrayed. Un-American in the sense that I think it's fair to say America is a very individualistic country. It's in many ways not really communally oriented in the way other countries are. And that in itself has been really interesting to navigate with nonprofit work. I do think in the Bay Area, there's a very rich tradition of nonprofits. And if you look in major metro areas too, and NGOs are sometimes what they're called, but nonprofits, 501c3s exist a lot. But I can see people grappling this work and constantly looking at it through the lens of self-interest. Why would someone want to do this work? When you're underpaid, you clearly have educational credentials that can earn you like a decent living. It may not be like $1 billion kind of Titan of industry kind of role, but you can make a decent living. But for me, again, it was always wanting to serve, the U.S. in a very interesting way, reach across different communities. And for me, that's always been the joy in the nonprofit work that I do, to be able to connect with, Black community leaders in Baby Hunters Point, or Chinatown leaders who have been working in San Francisco Chinatown for a long time, which is also very distinct by my estimation from Oakland Chinatown, for instance. To me, the book is also about the beauty of San Francisco, that each block, each neighborhood has its own unique set of histories to acknowledge and respect. And I've always loved that about doing the nonprofit work that I do.
Well, let me push a little bit on that. A lot of advocacy, especially when this comes from, if you are an outsider, can be paternalistic, could be using your sense of privilege to make yourself feel better for the sacrifices you're incurring. But you're also an insider to the community as well, and recognize that we as an Asian American community have our own issues. How do you, again, relate to these communities? How do you relate to your own sense of community identity to bridge communities, or also recognize the differences between communities?
I think in the longer arc of things, staying power matters. So sticking around the community, not coming in for whatever it is, 2 or 3 years at a time. And I will acknowledge there's a lot of turnover in the nonprofit sector, partly because the work is so difficult to begin with. It's, underpaid, but it's emotionally very exhausting too, to give in that manner and not necessarily receive something back in the kind of typical transactional worldview that we all have. But I think that staying power matters. I think the approach itself matters too. So how you're approaching people. I always try to relay this to employees as well as even student classes, for instance, that are very interested in nonprofit work, to not come in with the so-called savior complex. And I think it's also typical of lawyers as well, who are very, it's almost like that John Grisham novel of like, I carry the suitcase into the courtroom and I save the day, and everything neatly resolves in the movie sense, like in a 2-hour period. Again, real life doesn't work like that. It's much messier. So as long as you come with measured expectations, and then also, I think most importantly, measure the community's expectations of what, you're there to serve, that's always helpful.
So you've mentioned several times actually both the sacrifice of doing the nonprofit work and also the messiness of it, and sometimes the unmeasurable success. So can you speak about, you write a lot about the sacrifices, again, of your grandparents, your parents, and then your own sacrifices in this work. How would you recommend, younger people entering this type of work, how they respond to have to give having to give up a lot of their time, their relationships, their career ambitions, and then also not always seeing success in the community work.
It's a hard, expectation to measure for oneself.
Can you give us a meaning of life, Eddie?
I think it takes like some kind of sense of self, first of all, to even be in this work in the first place. So, I've always been comfortable even being alone in that way. I think like, for me, I would also, admit to being an introvert, for instance, at the end of the day. I don't feed off the energy of other people, but I do have a social battery in which I can interact with a lot of people to begin with. And then hopefully, like, it's measured over time. It's not constantly being drained in that way. If I had some sort of advice about entering, nonprofit work and, trying to be more generous to others, it might be about, putting yourself out there, but also making sure it's not totally out there to a point where you're sacrificing everything as well. So always hold a little bit back for yourself too.
Well, then, it seems like your art is actually the way you sustain yourself. And can you talk about how, because you spent hours. Can you tell the audience how many hours you spent?
5,000 hours. And over 5 years, 10 sketchbooks. A lot of work went into this. There's that Malcolm Gladwell saying the 10,000 hour rule, so I guess it's half. So maybe the next book will be even better, and the masterpiece that Malcolm Gladwell thinks about.
Yeah, so how did art sustain you? Again, did you just start doing the art and then thought, okay, maybe I'll tell my story as well? Or because you were doing the fictional work.
Yes, and the fiction work too, I've described it as a way of neatly tying up a narrative, which is true. It was also highly personal. The turtle comic, for instance, that it was an angry talking turtle that tried to sell coffee across San Francisco. And that kind of entrepreneurial ambition was reflected, I would say, in my own grandfather. Like, he really, after the Korean War, wanted to build up his own business and empire unto itself. It never quite worked out in the way he wanted to, and much to the frustration of himself and his family. So for me, like, fiction was always, a very fun way of adding in tons of humor and, sarcasm into a narrative. In real life, like, that can often come off as like angry or vindictive. So there's a bit of that in the memoir, but hopefully not too much, so that it's, I often think of it as the medicine that goes with sugar. You want a bit of sugar in that medicine.
So, again, you said that it's hard to come up with an ending, right? To have an arc. So, did you feel like, as a memoir, I need to have some awakening to tell a story that gets to self-awareness, or does it end with you like, what's going on? I have no idea still.
There's a couple people who have already read the book who have commented on like the motivations, right? And one of the things I wanted to really avoid with the book, I understand, of course, it's a graphic memoir, it's about my life, but I wanted to try to avoid this idea of like myself as a literal superhero. Like, for me, that's not what even my nonprofit work is about to begin with. It's about hopefully, empowering others in my mind and creating sustainable environments that allow them to make the choices and, seek out the resources that make their lives better. But not necessarily me, again, coming in and, fixing the situation for people. I feel like that's an unsustainable model unto itself. But the book is, as you can see, told in color washes. So the color, in many ways, indicates both time and mood of the era that it's in. And you'll notice like flash forwards and flashbacks. And the way that's organized chapter by chapter is really kind of themes of generosity at the end of the day. So going to the end of the book, that's really what I wanted to end on. You'll see like the bright orange sky itself, and the final quote is supposed to, essentially reflect, hopefully the feeling that the reader will take away from the book, that the process itself never has some neat conclusion or end, but keeps on going.
Yeah, what I really like about this is that, you always wonder, did the writer or the artist intend this symbolism? Did they draw out that parallel for intent? Did they use that color? And how much do you think how much of your thought process and creative process was that intentional? I want to look at the multiple layers of sacrifice. I want to draw the parallels between my grandfather and his entrepreneurial spirit and my advocacy efforts. or did it just sort of emerge and you realize, wow, there is a lot of connection and ties?
It emerged over time, I would say. And it was, for me, again, it was not a fully scripted process. It was stuff I was posting on Instagram as I went along. For me, in creating this comic, the organization of the themes was probably the most important thing. And then the color, the kind of selection of stories that I told were really around those themes. And then over time, it was like, well, this is starting to fit like pieces of a puzzle. And I think the most helpful part of this process was really when a publisher reached out to me cold from posting this work on Instagram and wanted to know more about, the comics and had I thought through a print version of it. It ended up being a good process unto itself. It was a long one. It took roughly 2.5, 3 years. But as a result of that process, I think it then honed again the organization of the book and made it to what it is today.
Yeah, we were talking before about stories you were telling in this graphic novel and then the stories that you didn't tell. And one of the themes and one of the key moments was COVID-19 and the anti-Asian hate. And why was that a significant theme for you to include? And because you actually, at the end, talked about wrestling with how personal should I be about this experience.
A lot of it was, of course, the, imposed isolation, right? Both self-imposed and, more controversially later on through government regulation, which people reacted negatively to. But there was that kind of social distancing aspect, which I thought contrasted really well with the idea of community building and how difficult it was to do at that time. So one of the hesitations I have with this book and communicating to younger readers are the slurs that are portrayed in the book. And I would say one kind of small craft thing that was really important to me to do was actually handwrite that and take ownership of it in a way that, the rest of the font, the typography in the book does not. The rest of it is mostly digital if you look at the book closely. So it was a hard choice to make. I'm still struggling with it. And again, maybe ask me in a month or two from now, like as I go on tour and talk to more people about the book, I'll know then if that was the right choice. Because I think a lot about the power of words and how they can carry on, and sometimes they don't carry on for the better too.
So it's not necessarily the situation you were worried about, it's actually the actual slurs employed against you that you didn't want to repeat and rehearse.
That's right, yeah. And then have their own staying power for people, other readers who I may not know, for instance, and want to carry it on. I think it's an interesting phrase to use.
Yeah, that's interesting. I make my whole living on anti-Asian hate now, so
maybe I created more work for you.
Keep it up. You got to name it. And again, the art. You say you're a self-made artist, a self-learned artist. What inspired you? How did you then learn? Is it just trial and error? That's why it took you 5,000 hours.
Yeah.
If you had gone to school,
That's about right. I mean, it was a lot of trial and error. And the book, again, is like organized mostly in chronological order. But there are parts of the art that I look nowadays. I'm a very kind of self-critical artist, and I kind of wince. I'm like, oh gosh, I could have drawn that better. I wish I had gone back in and like redrawn that section. You can't think that way in this kind of process. It's just too intense as an overall arc for you to constantly go back and revise. But yeah, I would say like the kind of trial and error process and self-learning that goes into this is evident in the book itself.
So if you leaf through the book or you look at the drawings, you'll see a lot of scenes of San Francisco. And so that's what's so fun for us to look at this book, right? It's like, I know that place. I go there, every weekend. And why? I even went to an Oakland Chinatown restaurant, and there was a picture, Eddie's drawing on the wall. And so why drawing local scenes? Why do you reference that so much?
So two reasons. One, sense of place has always been important to even my professional work. Environmental justice, to me, requires that sense of place, and knowing the neighborhoods and knowing why the communities and why they've come up the way they have. So that's why you'll see so many physical landmarks, buildings, cultural institutions reflected in this book. But also, for me too, like businesses, that's the family background I've grown up in. Like my parents, it's covered in the book, ran a liquor store, so I'm very aware of that kind of transactional worldview that can occur over a cash register or a counter. I will say for the Oakland Chinatown piece of art, the family there is generally really happy about the book. I just saw them last week. And owner Charles always has some crazy crack for me, which is along the lines of like, why did you make yourself look so good in this book, man? Or like, oh, why can't you make me look more handsome? Like it's you know, saying, for him, like they're just appreciative that their work is acknowledged, I think, in a very different way than what they're used to. And they've been running, you can look up press articles too about their own kind of family business and the trajectory of how they've built their own success. But it's a grinding amount of work, I would say, to run a small business to begin with.
So as you hear it, Eddie, you could hear and all the multiple layers and depth of this book, right? The themes of sacrifice and advocacy, the themes of place and placemaking, the themes of family and again I said family sacrifice, but family and then isolation versus community. And so it's an amazing book. I can't say enough about it. What then? So you're doing your advocacy work, and what then inspired you in the community to keep on doing what you're doing and to, again, want to write this book to encourage younger people to do it?
I don't know if this is the best answer, but there's not a lot of people doing it, which also propels me in some way. I will also say that I wouldn't go around saying like, oh, you should just be a martyr in a situation. Like I always really kind of cringe at the idea of like putting oneself out there in that way relentlessly. But we need more, I would say, advocates in our era. Like it's not done nearly enough, the kind of work that Brightline does and the work that I've done. So it's been an interesting trajectory to do all this, and I wouldn't have it any other way, as hard as it's been.
So I'm going to ask one last question. So you should all be thinking about your questions now, and then we're going to open it up to the audience. So, it's the story of you being the advocate, but it's also a story of you being the artist, right? And to be a creator and to narrate your own life and to narrate the community's life. And you talk a lot about your advocacy, but can you talk about like where you want to see your art going and your cartooning going, and why this medium and why this sort of form to express what you're doing?
Maybe another way of describing comics that I really like is it's essentially control over a page where you have an unlimited budget. You can do everything on the page as much as your imagination can stretch. You can build up, the panel sizes. You can vary them up to, for instance, a full double spread, a more kind of regimented 6-panel format, or even like the small kind of, if you look at that page and the way Chinatown is built out slightly more on that first line versus then the kind of smaller panel that exists in the Mission District. It's all ways to indicate like a sense of space and time that I don't think you can find in other mediums, movies, books, written books. And for me, like cartooning is really a first love. Like I've done other illustration work in the past, and I hope to keep on going in the future. I think the bigger question I have is whether I should be doing it on social media to begin with. I think my career has been built out on Instagram to some degree, and I want to reassure the readers there that I will still produce some illustration work. But part of the challenge with Instagram is that it's a very regimented one-by-one kind of square. It doesn't allow for as much innovation as you would on the printed page. So that's the kind of balancing act I'm going through as an artist right now.
So what's next? Is it continue the advocacy, do more of the cartooning, try to continue the parallel, intertwined paths?
Well, we'll see how this book sells to begin with. So hopefully people buy a second and third and fourth copy. But to the notion of like politics, I get that question occasionally, and the way I think about it is
Run, Eddie, run.
no. But I made this comment about 2 weeks ago now, and it was someone who asked it very directly to me, like, "Oh, are you thinking about running for office?" And for me, there are plenty of politicians in this world. What I don't know that there are enough of are artist, nonprofit lawyer advocates. And I would like to see more of that in this world. I hope you supporting this book also supports that vision. But yeah, that's the probably note I want to end with.
Okay, thank you. So we have plenty of time for questions from the audience. We have 20 minutes, so just raise your hand and shout it out. Yeah, please.
So, we talked a lot, or heard a lot about how laborious this process was, and how much COVID, how much work, and it's clear enough by Russia. But is there something that stands out to you as the most joyous part of this process, or this one of the stories in the book, or anything you learned about it, like that just you go back to, you're like, oh, this is why I did it, and this is why, this is what makes me happy?
Okay, I have to repeat the question for the people on Zoom. So you spoke a lot about the sacrifice, how laborious the work is, how isolating it is, especially during the pandemic. So what gave you joy in the process, beyond having everybody here celebrating you? What really stood out that really made you love doing this?
I'll talk about this page in particular because I think most everybody in the room can see it. You can see the food delivery that is represented during the pandemic, and to recognize other nonprofits that were creating the meals. For instance, it was Self-Help for the Elderly, Chinatown Community Development Center, and really what I was a volunteer driver, essentially using my old '09 Corolla, going about delivering these meals to essentially isolated homes, mostly low-income seniors, monolingual seniors, who didn't have access to whatever it was, grocery store shopping, meal delivery services. One of the interesting internal stories about this page is that when someone in the publishing industry originally read it, their immediate response was, well, I don't really get this page. Are you working for a tech startup here doing food delivery? It was, again, kind of like an interesting kind of transactional worldview of the world that I was worried about in putting out this book. I would say one thing that's given me joy is that people reading this page now in its broader context, they've taken something else very different from it. And maybe this is like the upsides and downsides of social media is that you can concentrate what's in front of you in your device in that kind of tight screen, but on its broader kind of book form, you can flip back and forth between the printed page and try to understand the story in its entirety. So that's been a joy in the art and the storytelling involved.
There's another person in the middle. Yeah, please.
I was wondering for your each of the pictures, did you actually take a physical picture and reference that when you were drawing, or is it based on memory, or were you actually sitting there and drawing?
Did you take photos of what you're drawing? Is it from memory, or were you just sitting there at each site for hours?
That's a really good question, and partly how I've taught myself to draw over time is I would say one technological innovation that really helped me teach myself how to draw was the iPad. It sounds really basic, but for me to take a phone, a smart, phone, picture and then translate it or put it on an iPad and then use that iPad to study how like the architecture of a room looks or how even one's face looks against, like if you look very closely at the bill of that cap and how it works against the face with the mask and the crinkles in it. That's all done through photographic references, like looking at the photo, translating as best as I can with a pencil initially to begin with. Then I go over it with a technical with brush pens, and then finally a color wash with Copic markers or alcohol-based watercolor-like markers that I've used. But yeah, I would say 70% of the drawings are probably photographic reference. They're not definitely for me just kind of like making it up in my head.
Did the pressure of publishing change your relationship to creativity, your own creativity?
Did the pressure of publishing change your relationship with the creative aspect and your own creativity?
Yes. and in some ways for the better, I would say. Because, again, I'll share another kind of fun story. There's a very gifted artist I know, Han Lee, and I, as a cartoonist, we would go to Comic Cons and table there with our comics, and again, those hand-stapled booklets that I have in the back. One time at Rose City Comic Con in particular in Portland, we were sitting in what's called the Artist Alley, which is essentially reserved for independent artists. It's not like the major publishers that you know, DC and Marvel. We were sitting there for about 6-7 hours without, a single person coming up to the table. And at a certain point in the distance, we saw a father and his child come closer and closer to our table, and we got very, very excited. And then you could see the father was exhausted from a day's being the entire day at the Comic-Con, and gently leading his son away from the table said, no, it's not famous, it's not famous. And so in that moment, like Han and I, our faces, you can imagine the slow motion kind of capture of our faces, like our cheerful spirits lifting and then our faces falling as soon as that leading away happened. But I would say, like, commerce is what it is. It's how art is sustainable in our capitalistic era. I am very appreciative of now being able to produce this book at scale. I do think one of the creative kind of pushes that needed to happen with myself was even structuring the initial thing I mentioned, the 10 short stories, into what are now 7 much more linear chapters. And that creates a better, in my mind, kind of arc to the book and makes it more of a graphic memoir rather than, say, a collection of short stories.
Does it change your sense of audience? So when you're drawing for yourself, you're drawing for yourself. But when you're thinking about the audience and the audience you want to sell to, how does that shape your art?
Yeah, I would say, again, this book was driven page by page, hand-drawn. In many ways, it was a journey, that saying, a journey of 1,000 miles begins with one step. So in some ways, I just had to get a page done at a time. And then the overall kind of metric that was given to me by the publisher was 200 pages, 200 plus pages. And knowing how, intensely hand-drawn my work was, you can do the math, essentially, like, a single page in this book is probably somewhere between 7 to 15 hours of hand drawing. Then it's scanned in, and it's additional 10 to 20 hours of Photoshop work, like essentially digitally editing the page, adding in speech bubbles, text, etc., to make it the comic that it is, even redrawing the borders, which you'll notice are very kind of clean cut. So that kind of intensive, process page by page, I think, is just how I've approached this book and gotten it done.
I have 2 questions, actually. So the first question is, from my perspective, it sounds like you actually have 3 or 4 jobs, and then you're also a graphic novelist. So what advice would you give someone who, works as much, maybe not as much as you, but a lot, and also wants to be creative? So that's my first question.
Okay, first question is, you have multiple jobs. What advice do you have for someone who wants to do creative work?
Do you want me to answer that first? Okay. I would say make it a practice, build out time for yourself. And for me, the nonprofit work is a lot of fun. I wouldn't do it unless I loved it day to day. But I also recognize it's not healthy to do it. I have done it for 100, 120-hour work weeks. But it's good to measure it down to, maybe a more manageable 40 to 50-hour work week, and then build in a separate creative practice that is in your mind. For me, at least, it has to be structured. So the making of this book was probably somewhere between 20 to 30 hours a week. I did the math after a while. So close to a full-time job, but not quite either. And there's also physical limitations to how much sometimes you can do in a creative practice as well. So for hand drawing, like after a while, like my hand was cramping up and I couldn't simply work my way, through the pain unless I break my hand. But for, for balancing the two, I think it just depends, like how demanding one's job is and how much creative kind of mental space you have to work through something as well.
My second question is, if we read the book and we really love it, what are like 2 or 3 things we can do to support sales?
Wow. If we really love the book, and you will, what are 2 things you will be doing to support the book?
One thing is rate and review the book on
That's a long
Goodreads.
question, huh?
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Well, Goodreads is one platform which I've been told acts as a pretty kind of rough and tumble social media space unto itself. So brace yourself if you go on that platform. I could say rate and review on Amazon, but of course we are in a local bookstore. Thank you, Car, for closing your ears there. But yeah, so, spreading the good word about the book on whatever platforms there are to review books is always helpful. I will say check out the nonprofit too that I work for as well. I have a few staff members here. Do you want to raise your hands, or are you going to be shy? Yes, hooray. But check out the nonprofit's work too at brightlinedefense.org. And then we have social media channels as well. But it's something that I don't imagine stopping doing anytime soon. The teasing question I often get is like, oh, you've gotten this book out now, and do you just want to do this full time? I think the short answer to the question is no. I still very much love my day job and hope, again, to balance the 2 practices.
Oh, yeah.
Do you have a story in mind for the next book? Like, is there a next story that you haven't drawn yet that you're like, when I have time, this is it?
So what's the next story? Advocate 2. Advocate.
One personal thing to mention about the ending chapter of Advocate is my father's health, which I'm still very worried about. And without perhaps disclosing too much about his condition, he's been going through a rough time. My own kind of, and this is things I think about from the larger kind of context of taking care of our family's health too, and like what it means for one's own mental health, and sense of place and space to be able to take care of one's family. That might be a core point in the second book to explore. Hopefully, fingers crossed, my father's health will get better. But I will just be upfront and say the signs are not looking good in that regard too. And it might be a drawn out process. We'll see. On a more kind of positive note, I would also like to track maybe the trajectory of my art career a little bit better too. There are fun public art projects I'm thinking through. One such project is actually a mural potentially in San Francisco that's much bigger than the sidewalk art, the utility box art that's portrayed on that particular vertical page you see up there. So hopefully that project will come to fruition in 2 to 3 months from now.
Okay, 1 or 2 last questions. Any online questions? Online people, you can ask questions. Oh,
Yes.
yeah, sure.
I have 2 questions. What age did you start drawing?
What age did you start drawing?
I started when I was very young, probably 5 or 6, I would say. And the book actually covers this as well. My parents, when they ran their store, they would often put my sister in the back room because it's not, proper to have your kids hanging out in front of the cash register all the time. And then I would spend a lot of time drawing on just whatever scraps of paper were available. So it could be anything as basic as like a cardboard box, or it could be, the nicer stuff was, oh gosh, I'm going to date myself now. There was line paper, like spooled paper, that you could just roll out in big scrolls and just keep on drawing.
My second question is, who influenced you, or like what influenced you to go and start cartooning?
Excellent question. What influenced you to start cartooning?
Reading comic books and comic strips. So there's always a couple titles to recommend, but I think the most influential one I would say was Bill Watterson's Calvin and Hobbes. I really loved that as a child. I would also get all the books, and then I remember read it aloud to my sister at the time as well. So it was a very kind of social activity to even share that comic strip art with her. But I would just say read what you like. If you're inspired by it, then you should totally try to I would advise against straight up tracing and copying. Be inspired by it loosely, but it's okay to also copy it first as well, to learn as you go.
Last question.
You've put a lot of work and time and heart into this book. We've heard so much about what you put into the book. What has it given you back?
You put so much into this book. What has it given you back?
This moment. That's the shortest answer. But thank you again for being here tonight. There are many friends in this room and a lot of faces I don't recognize too, which is very heartening as well. This book, again, was a very tough, laborious process, but I think what you're seeing here tonight is really, is extraordinary. So thank you for making it out, and please help yourself to more wine. I see some more in the corner there.
Okay, well, thank you, Eddie, for inspiring us with your art, with your coaching.
Can we give one more hand for Eddie and Dr. Jeung?
I do want Eddie to have the last word, so I will be very brief and echo his thank you again. And we all really appreciate it. And it is tremendous to see so many people here. We have books by both of our authors at the front register. You can find them there. Eddie is going to be signing, Eddie and Dr. Jeung, if you ask politely, will be signing books right here. We're going to take a beat, make sure they're comfortable, and you can line up right here. We're going to make sure you're comfortable too. We are open till 9 p.m. Please browse until then. I hear there's more wine. And if not, or if you need anything else, do ask me. And if not, we'll see you next time. Thank you so much.